Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased to be able to stand in opposition to this legislation, and I am ashamed that Parliament is using its time to progress something which in legislation will not achieve one single point of what is described as the aim of the legislation. This bill will do nothing at all to reduce offending. If there was legislation before the House to reduce offending, to make our families and our communities safer, there would be unanimous approval. This bill does nothing to reduce re-offending, something which we should all be very seriously concerned about. If the bill did something about re-offending, it would again get unanimous support from this House, and it does nothing at all to support victims of crime, something which the Minister, the now Minister responsible for this legislation, said in her comments in this third reading that she cared about. Well, Mr Speaker, if she did, why doesn't her legislation do anything to better support the victims of crime in our community? Then we would support it. So it does nothing. It does nothing, and actually backed up by the advice from many of the officials who were not able to give that advice directly to the Select Committee. It does nothing to address the causes of crime. Simon Power, the Minister who should have been responsible for this legislation, had a big get-together looking at the drivers of crime. He did it in a very inclusive way, and he invited all sorts of people to that conference. They were serious about saying, what are the drivers of crime? What causes crime in our community, and what should we as a Parliament be doing about that? And instead we get this load of dribble, which frankly I think Simon Power is really relieved to not be responsible for, because he knows it is an embarrassment to him and his government and to the big get-together that he called to look at the drivers of crime. It offers victims false hope, which I think is the most despicable thing, actually. We as a Parliament should be upfront with the fact that if we haven't got enough support for people we care about, then we will agree to do more. But instead, they offer this dribble driven by, one of the biggest dribblers of all in terms of substantial policy, the Sensible Sentencing Trust representative in our Parliament, and it just offers victims hope that will never be delivered. Mr Speaker, I think that victims deserve better than that from our Parliament. I want to pick up on the process point that my colleague Grant Robertson raised during his contribution earlier this afternoon. It is an absolute outrage that the proper officials, the Ministry of Justice officials, who are entitled to give their opinion to the Executive and to Parliament through the Select Committee process, were stopped by Minister Judith Collins from giving their advice to a Select Committee. I have never heard of such a breach of rights of an open, democratic parliamentary process. It's just extraordinary, and people in this House should be outraged about it, and actually, Mr Speaker, should demand the Speaker's consideration of this very point, that when members of the Select Committee ask for the proper officials, the justice officials, to give advice to the Select Committee, they could have done it with other officials. That's a very common practice. The Executive of the government barred them from giving that advice. I think we have a right to advice. We have a right to competing advice. If that's what the officials feel, that's the advantage of public service.
Nothing democratic in that.
But, Mr Speaker, it's not surprising that that advice was stopped, though. I'll give you an example of what the justice officials have said about this bill. They said it's unlikely to be consistent with the government's publicly announced policy in regard to the drivers of crime. So the Ministry of Justice said this legislation goes absolutely against what the Minister of Justice said was the government's policy intention in terms of the drivers of crime. So it's not just not very competent, it's not just not very robust, it goes against the stated government policy outlined by Simon Power. Mr Speaker, it wasn't just justice officials that said that. Te Puni Kokiri, the police, the Treasury, corrections have all said this is a rubbish bill driven, oh no, they didn't say driven by a rubbish member because they're high-quality public servants, but they said this bill would not achieve the purpose that the Minister has outlined. It won't reduce offending, it won't reduce reoffending, and it won't support the victims of crime. It is just a way of keeping the ACT party quiet. Well, good luck to the government on that particular point. So Justice weren't consulted on this particular piece of legislation. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about another group of people who weren't consulted about this legislation, and that is the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health were not asked for their opinion on the implications of transferring large sections of the Crimes Act into this legislation and completely redefining the nature of offending. There were no public health experts asked about the provision in the Crimes Act which has been moved into this three strikes legislation. The public health advice would have been that including section 201, the part referred to by the chair of the committee, infecting with disease, into this legislation sends entirely the wrong message to people who we want to be free of disease and free of infecting other people of disease. It gives them entirely the wrong message from Parliament about discrimination, about stigmatisation, and it drives risk-taking behaviour underground. That would be the public health advice if the Select Committee had bothered to ask for it. The Minister of Health should know about those issues. He is responsible for public health in New Zealand. He has recently been alerted to the concerns of the New Zealand AIDS Foundation in this regard, that transferring this section from the Crimes Act into this legislation does send the wrong message about public health. And when the Minister of Health was asked to put public health considerations first on our agenda of this Parliament, what did the Minister of Health do? The Minister of Health was asked, put public health first, and what he did, Mr Speaker, was refer those concerns to the Minister of Corrections, who, interestingly enough, is not responsible for public health in New Zealand. I don't know why the Minister of Health collects his salary if when he's asked about a major public health concern, refers it to one of his colleagues. If he can't do the job, he should hand the whole lot of it over to someone else. Mr Speaker, the other interesting bit of information that has come to light during this debate is that the public health bill that is on the floor of Parliament is also going to be moved into a justice environment. So we were going to be giving public health messages and concerns into a criminal and justice framework. Clause 127 of the Public Health Bill is going to be moved into the Crimes Against a Person legislation. Well, I want to implore the Minister of Health to do better on that bit of legislation than he has on his response to this legislation. When a public health issue is raised with the Minister of Health, he should take it seriously. He should use the privilege of his position to respond to those concerns, and even if it was a matter of delaying the progress of this legislation, to get the concerns aired properly and debated and hopefully resolved, then I certainly would have been supportive of that, but he took no such measure. He washed his hands of it. It's bad news, it's a bit tricky, it's a bit difficult. Washed his hands of it and left it over to Judith Collins to respond to. Mr Speaker, if this legislation did anything to reduce offending, did anything to reduce re-offending, did anything to better support victims of crime in our community, then Labor would support that. It fails on every single measure. It doesn't offer us safer prisons, it doesn't offer us safer communities, It doesn't offer us safer families. This is a wasted